Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore.
Welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. Today is a long-awaited show. We actually planned on doing the show a couple weeks ago, but my original guest has some issues in his life, and he just couldn't be here. But I have another guy who absolutely is the right person to talk about this today, and that's Victor Black. He'll be joining us in just a minute. But, of course, first I have to get out of the way that this show is made possible through a generous sponsorship by Legendary Foods. And I'm very proud to represent Legendary Foods because they do an amazing job at making snacking good for you. All of their products, from their seasoned nuts, their decadent nut butters, and their tasty pastry, which is basically a pop tart with 9 grams of high leucine protein and less than 1 gram of sugar, are all worthy of your purchasing dollars. If you go to the website eatlegendary.com and you use the code SHR, you'll save 10% off of everything, and everything is worthy of your taste buds. So check them out, show them some love. They literally make this show possible. So we're going to be talking about an interesting compound today with Victor Black. Victor is a prolific writer about, quite frankly, performance-enhancing drugs, and also a world-class bodybuilder. How you doing, Victor? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing very well, Carl. Thank you for having me on.
So this is an interesting compound. It's relatively new on the scene, but it's absolutely intriguing for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about today. Within the community of performance, those who embrace performance-enhancing drugs, and it's called YK-11. Do we know what pharmaceutical company has produced this so far? This research chemical as it is right now?
Well, firstly, I would agree with you. It's an absolutely fascinating chemical compound. I think it has captured the imagination of a great many people in our community. As far as the commercial development of the product goes, there were a number of, let's call them mechanistic studies undertaken by a Japanese research company firm with some support from Japanese universities. But to the very best of my knowledge, the product went no further than the synthesization of the compound for those mechanistic studies, and then it was abandoned. So it never went into any animal models or any human model testing, period, basically.
Well, there are some rodent model tests, but with that being said, when a company abandons a compound, that should speak volumes. And I'll give you, for instance, everybody loves MK677, except the people who have done the research on MK677 and realize that it is to the pituitary and growth hormone production what androgen deprivation therapy is to testosterone and the gonads. It exhausts the pituitary. It can only be used for short periods of time. And so you have to ask yourself, why would Merck go to all this expense to come up with an orally active ghrelin agonist, if you will, that produces growth hormone and then abandon it? Because now we have and it's because it doesn't work, or when it does work, the outcomes aren't good. So that alone should tell us that YK-11 is probably something that we should be very cautious in thinking about. Would you agree with that broad statement?
As a general rule of thumb, I would recommend that most people in our tribe, if I can use that term, would be very well served by using the dozens and dozens of compounds that we have available to us that are approved for human use. So not only have they undergone some level of clinical trials in humans, they've actually passed out the other side through toxicity testing, etc. We have dozens of compounds that can serve our purposes extremely well. For some reason, we fascinated, I would even say obsessed about compounds that didn't make it that far, and very often it's almost like the mythology that's attached to them rather than the realities of the compounds. We'll talk about that as we go on, but yeah, in general, I would say there are multiple metabolic pathways we can modulate today in 2020. There are many different, drug candidates that we can consider, and there are many that, not only have been evaluated in humans, they've been through, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials, and they've been in, approved human use for decades in some cases. And yet, as I said, for some quirky reason, we like to obsess about these drugs that, never really made it to market. And quite bluntly, there are some reasons for that, which we can talk about later on. But yes, it is an anomaly of that drug.
Is YK-11 a SARM or is it an androgen? Because isn't it a form of allopregnenolone?
It's actually both, and this is why people are so confused on the subject. Because if you could bear with me just one moment, I will explain the context here. But it does take just a moment. So back in 1935 or whenever they synthesized testosterone, pretty quickly when they started looking at this for its therapeutic benefits, they realized that for the androgen sensitive communities, women, children, the elderly, that they needed to basically make a compound that had the therapeutic benefits of testosterone, but it was less androgenic in impact. In other words, it was tissue selective. So all of the steroids that most people have in common practice today are called steroidal SARMs. They are effectively androgen receptor modulators that are tissue selective, but basically they never managed to rid these drugs of all of their androgenic components. There's always been remnants left behind, even with the most benign of these compounds like Anabolic. There's enough androgen there for research to say, look, we can probably do better today. We can get rid of that last little vestige and just have the anabolic component. And so really, when you look at these compounds, you have to look at them and say, look, Anavar, Primobolan, Masteron, all of these drugs are SARMs. Trenbolone is a SARMs.
Right.
The difference is those drugs are basically steroidal SARMs, and what people refer to, in colloquial terms as SARMs, are based on different chemical frameworks, not derived from the testosterone molecule. This compound ultimately has a gonad core. That means it's an anabolic and androgenic steroid, period. But it is also a SARM. It is a steroidal SARM.
Yeah, because it is selective in the way that it activates the mosaic of the receptor as opposed to whole scale activation, which testosterone does. It's interesting, that is worth the price of admission, what you just said just there, because I've always suspected that things like decadurabolin, they are SARMs. They activate the androgen receptor slightly differently than testosterone does. DHT, it is a selective androgen receptor modulator as well. And you put it so eloquently. These are all SARMs. Some either come from the skeletal system of testosterone and others originate completely from chemical combinations entirely.
Absolutely. And this is one of my great passions is trying to explain to people what seems like the never-ending mythology and misunderstanding of these compounds. Even Trenbolone is, the great, example that I always wheel out. Trenbolone is a SARMs. It is in fact less androgenic than testosterone, and it's less anabolic than testosterone as well. And I could demonstrate this, through the evidence, but also just in a practical application. When Trenbolone was in human clinical use, it was given to women for the indication of osteoporosis. Why the hell would you give a drug that is many times more androgenic than testosterone as a treatment methodology for osteoporosis? It just doesn't make any sense. And it all stems back to this, back in the 1960s, there were testings done on these things in rodent models that showed some very, very strange outcomes. And we are almost obsessed about what we call the Hirschberger assay. It's this androgenic and that anabolic ratio, as it were, attached to these compounds. And in reality, when you look at the way these drugs are evaluated, first they do a binding assay, then they do a HB assay, the rat model, and then ultimately those two phases are really intended to get the drug into human clinical use to see what happens. Ultimately, that's the point. And so when you look at this discussion about anabolic and androgenic ratios, you have to understand that there's absolutely no evidence at all in the literature that supports this idea that this particular drug is more anabolic than that particular drug. They all milligram for milligram in human beings in all the trials we work doing. And the idea that there's a drug out there that produces 5 times the anabolic potential than another drug in human beings is it's just not what you see in real life.
Right. No, it very eloquently put, and I think we could leave that there. One of the things that seems fascinating to me about this compound YK-11 is that it increases the expression of follistatin. For anybody who followed Dr. Se-Jin Lee back in the day when he discovered myostatin, and I had the privilege of communicating with him. He was resistant to talk about his discovery in the context of muscle building without disease. He wanted to rid the world of muscle wasting diseases. But what I learned from him was, and if you go back and look at his original research, he had 2 rodent models that he used. One was the double myostatin null that we see in the animal world today, in the case of the Piedmontese cow and the Belgian blues, and we even see it in whippets now and racing dogs. We see myostatin null animals that just produce 2, 3, and even 4-fold more muscle than their non-myostatin inhibited litter mates. But what he also did was he created a follistatin overexpressing rodent. And where the myostatin null rodent had 4 to 5 times more muscle than the wild rodent, the follistatin overproducing rodent had 4 to 5 times more muscle than the myostatin null rodent, which made me abandon looking at myostatin inhibition. I've done numerous shows over the past 14 years about myostatin inhibition. And the best show I did was with a group out of the State University of New York system that showed that you have to suppress myostatin a minimum of 94% to even see changes in already existing mature muscle. And if you don't keep it suppressed by 98%, these changes are minimal. And the second that you remove the suppression, you go right back to being where you were before. You lose all of this muscle. But the real value I always felt was elevating follistatin, which is possible. Even Vince Gironda, for some reason, he knew that fertilized eggs built more muscle than non-fertilized eggs, that chickens that lay eggs in the presence of a rooster, they built more muscle. He used to tell guys, eat fertilized eggs. Well, we come to find out that fertilized egg yolks have a large amount of follistatin in them. So follistatin has always been fascinating to me because you could raise follistatin easier than you could suppress myostatin, and the end result was much grander muscle creation. This compound appears to increase follistatin. That is fascinating to me.
Okay, it is fascinating. The challenge is it's also an extremely complicated and convoluted conversation. So most people that consider this subject seem to see myostatin inhibition as through a single pathway, the pathway that you spoke about, the escalation of follistatin. There are actually a half a dozen different pathways that could potentially lead to that outcome. And each one of them is both fascinating, but not without its own issues. I guess before we dive too deep into that, I would just like to basically say this. A lot of, and I will take on board the comment you made about the degree with which you need to suppress myostatin. But most people would not be familiar with the fact that at least a dozen compounds over the last 10 years have been evaluated for clinical application for this purpose. The unmet need is tremendous. Nobody is going to argue this, particularly in applications like sarcopenia, and muscular dystrophy, and we can go. We're not talking about getting jacked. We're talking about therapeutic benefits for people with, clinical conditions that require treatment. So there is a large market for it. Potentially, the largest one of all is simply the treatment of sarcopenia because it affects us all at some point. Right? However, when you look at the success, no one has brought a drug to market in all that time with all these rewards and offers that actually does what is promised. So when you start looking at these compounds, by all means, I think we should look at them. I think they're also very fascinating, but I think it's very simplistic to say, look, here's a drug that we have some technical papers on that describe the potential mechanism, but we also can look at, I can show you a dozen examples of drugs that have exactly those papers to support the, the mechanistic action that never made it through
Right.
clinical trials.
They're not effective. A lot of times
they don't work.
Yeah.
So the reason these companies spend 10, 15, 20 million dollars getting them into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials is because they look so promising, right? But not one has panned out. And there is no clinically effective, and what I mean by effective, I mean safe, efficient, cost-effective drug that has been brought to market to meet that massive need of treating sarcopenia through that metabolic pathway. And so you have to take a huge leap of faith that says, well, here's a drug that comes along that happens to do all of that, but it's been abandoned along the way. There's a reason it was abandoned. The most likely, most logical, most rational reason it was abandoned is those researchers figured out that's not going to work.
Not working. Yeah, otherwise they wouldn't. That we're talking about billions of dollars in potential.
They would have sold it to one of the. Even if they didn't have the money to bring it to market, someone would have stepped in and bought the rights to the drug. Now you can make a tremendous argument about the big pharma, and I agree with that. I don't have a problem with that, but it doesn't make any sense that there is a massive unmet need for a drug that. Here's a drug that does everything that's promised, and it's safe, and it's effective, and it's and it's just been abandoned by the world of research. And
it's unheard of.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about why is YK-11 in this earlier slide that I had up, where we talked about the follistatin producing effects of YK-11, and then even in this one here, which talks about bone mineral density. YK-11 seems to be compared to DHT in all of these. Why would they do that?
I think that DHT is the comparative drug for all SARMs.
Because it's so strong. It's so strong.
Well, not necessarily. So if you look at if I go back to that original statement where they were developing drugs that were designed to replicate the clinical benefits of testosterone without the negative side effects, at some point you have to compare it to testosterone, the comparator. So every single SARMs that's ever been evaluated, every single steroidal SARM, ASA we'll call them, anabolic steroids, has at some point either been compared to DHT or to testosterone propionate, one or the other, sometimes both. That's the industry standard. That's how it's done. So that's why they compare it to DHT. Because would I be accurate by saying that DHT is the most androgenic of all of the steroid hormones? It's the one that's responsible for differentiating a clitoris into a penis in the first trimester of a baby's life. It's the one that's responsible for influencing sexual differentiation in the third trimester of a fetus's life. It's responsible for, the lack of it is responsible for monarch and dicryptokidism, where testicles don't drop. Isn't DHT the one that we blame for hair loss, hair growing where we don't want it, acne? DHT, when it comes to androgenicity, DHT is king, is it not? I would argue that's conditionally true. So I'll give you an example. Dose is ultimately the major issue here. Dose. How much are we talking about, Jereen? So if you consider the drug Proviron, for example, Proviron is not terribly dissimilar to DHT in its chemical structure, Jereen.
Great stuff.
Not a drug you should give to women, Jereen. But interestingly, it also has the dubious record of being the drug that's been tested at the highest dose in humans at 450 milligrams per day. Now, I would have thought you give someone 450 milligrams of a drug so closely related to DHT as Proviron is that you're just asking for a world of fucking problems. But no, it's quite tolerated. And this is the classic example. So people say it behaves like DHT. My argument is, what DHT derivative are you talking about? Do you mean DHT or do you mean a derivative of DHT? Because once you start to modify chemical molecules like testosterone or DHT, you start to create compounds that can behave in profoundly different ways than the parent molecule, just by some very simple chemical things. But ultimately, to try and answer your question, I would say conditionally true, dependent on the dose.
Yeah. And I happen to like Masteron, which is a DHT, right? Yeah.
Fabulous.
And it's a great molecule to keep it clinical. But I also like Tren, I mean, which is actually a progestin. A lot of people think that, Tren is and this is another thing that I don't want to, but tangentially, people like to, within the bodybuilding community, love to bash estradiol. Well, estradiol is anabolic. If you don't think it's anabolic, ask yourself why farmers give cows Finaplex with beta estradiol in it as opposed to just trenbolone by itself. And they'll put on 5 pounds of muscle a day more if you add estradiol. If that's not anabolic, I don't know what it is. People say, well, it's fluid. It's fluid. Well, I don't know about that. Sarcoplasmic.
I could not agree with you more. In fact, one of my predictions is that in the coming years, we will start to see an escalation in the use of estrogens as performance-enhancing drugs. Like, I'm talking about the administration of estrogens, as a PED itself. Let me just back up, though, the point you made about Trenbolone. This is one of my concerns about YK-11. So when you look at Trenbolone, most people would say, look, Trenbolone's a fabulous compound. It's hard to argue that it doesn't work magnificently well, right? But there's also a reasonable argument there are some issues. Many of those issues are its impact on cognitive function. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, but to be fair, all anabolic steroids do. But there's something unique about that drug that can mess with some individuals who are particularly sensitive in very profound ways. And it's not its androgen component. It's the fact that it interacts with the progestin receptor that does that. In fact, many of the side effects of Trenbolone, the sweating, that's progesterone, the anxiety, that's...
You just have to look to the menopause community to understand what happens when progesterone and estradiol become out of whack. Hot flashes, sleeplessness, anxiety. I mean, that's trend. That's trend.
So one of the problems is when you look at the synthetic progestins as opposed to progesterone, right? They are not identical. They are metabolized in slightly different ways, and progestins do not carry many of the same benefits that progesterone does. So progesterone is a cognitive protective compound, for example. But in progestins, synthetic versions of these compounds are actually not good for your brain at all. And this is one of the leakages that we see from Trenbolone. Guess what YK-11 is? It's in that same class of compound. So really, we would expect to see very, very, very similar consequences in terms of what are the negative ramifications of this compound. You really have to look at not necessarily its on androgen receptor impact, because the way Trenbolone works is, yes, it binds with the androgen receptor, but its magic, right, is not through the androgen receptor, it's through non-classical genomic pathways. That's the magic of the drug, including its impact with progesterone, right, or the progesterone receptor, sorry.
Right.
So YK-11 is not the same drug, but it is a drug that is also potentially capable of influencing the progesterone receptor. And because it is a synthetic progestin, that doesn't bode well for things like cognitive function. In fact, you mentioned estrogen. One of the problems with synthetic progestins is they offset many of the benefits of estrogen.
Right.
So there's all these little threads that you can pull on. The challenge is that most people either don't want to or not interested or are unaware of these threads, and they look at something in far too simplistic black and white terms. Here's a paper that says it might potentially be a myostatin inhibitor. Great, let's use that product, as it were. And I'm not suggesting for a moment you shouldn't read these papers and be fascinated by these compounds. I encourage let's dig in and let's talk about these things. But the moment you start pulling on these threads, there are a great many questions that we simply don't have answers to. And so therefore you have to look at it and say, I always suggest to guys when they're looking at compounds, you need to ask yourself a series of very logical, rational questions before you consider taking a drug. The first of which is, so what's on offer? What's the promise, right?
Yeah, what am I going to get, right?
What am I going to get? So the second one is, by what mechanism of action is that potentially true, plausibly true? And then the third question is, so what other compound do we have available to us today that potentially offers us that benefit through the same mechanistic pathway that has already been through all these approvals processes? So we don't have the same degree of concern about we don't really know. And as I said at the beginning, when you look at all of the drugs that are in human clinical use, we have like an abundance of drugs to consider today. And I don't mind if people want to look at research chemicals, but you need to see them in the context of what they are, and that is things that you might experiment a little with, but they're not necessarily drugs that you want to, what I call use as basal PDs, drugs that you would live on for the next 10 years. They don't deserve
and I have not been attracted to SARMs. I used some of the earlier SARMs, the first round that had come out. I can't even remember the name of them, but it's like for pretty much of my physical culture, career, or life, I've depended on testosterone for everything. And I'm not a blast and cruise kind of guy. Although I do now, just because I haven't been training as much during COVID, and I've definitely lost muscle and a lot of conditioning, which I'm about to kickstart my ass back in gear here very shortly. But I don't think there's anything you can't do with 600 milligrams of testosterone a week that you can do with some exotic, unknown, chemical. I just don't see it. I don't understand it. I don't. What's wrong? And what's wrong with androgenicity? I mean, I don't understand what the big deal is, quite frankly.
I would argue this because people, if I have a reputation for being that guy, as it were, I suppose people see me as the guy who's interested in longevity. I'm 53 years old. I currently compete in masters class competition. I've been doing this a long time, and I'm not giving up. I got another 20 years plus ahead of me in this game, right? So I'm very, very interested in saying, look, what you might get away with for 12 weeks is a very different conversation with what might be advice for the next 12 years. These are two different conversations. So I'm very often asked by people who reach out to me who are principally interested in health first, so outcomes, but along with health. And I think it's fair to say that our tribe can be divided into different groups. There's the TRT tribe, where they're very strictly within the boundaries of what's physiological range. Let's call it that, yeah. And then there's a group of people out there, which quite bluntly, they just use too many drugs. Let's just call them, they're abusing these compounds. I tend to, it's a scarily similar name to your show. I use the term supernatural man. This is the term that I like to use for myself. And what that means to me is basically we are modulating multiple metabolic pathways through different compounds, but basically just incrementally lifting ourselves up to either, at or just outside of what's plausibly natural. And when you look at it, you go, well, some testosterone and some growth hormone and some insulin and some metabolic modulator and some metformin and some this. I mean, you could very quickly assemble a list of a dozen drugs, which you could make very good arguments for their therapeutic benefits. And all of them have fabulous track records. You're not really taking any risk in terms of them individually. I do agree the risk becomes in polypharmacy, because none of the studies that we have look at using them all together.
All of them together, right? Exactly.
This is the risk of that model. Clearly every model has a risk. My model's risk is polypharmacy, but none of the compounds that I use at doses which I would consider to be abusive by themselves. So if you looked at just that drug in isolation, there's a very strong case you could make to say, look, you can use that drug, because. But my point being is, so if we're modulating the pathways you mentioned, the activation of the estrogen receptor is a hypertrophic pathway. I completely agree. You need estrogen. There's an androgen pathway. There's a HGH-IGF-1 pathway. There's a pathway. And if you start to modulate each of these, the one that's left clearly is myostatin inhibition. It's fascinating. I'm interested in it.
But the interesting thing is that training and the type of pharmacology that you're discussing does inhibit myostatin in and of itself.
Correct.
I mean, we know that.
Absolutely.
We know that. The reason myostatin inhibition is such a difficult thing is because it is driven by evolution. When we have developed things over a million years, it's really hard to undevelop them. And the reason for that is that throughout evolution, muscle was seen as a very metabolically expensive tissue because you had to eat then to support it. And so we evolved through selection pressure to have the ability to develop strength. Don't misunderstand. To develop strength. However, it's very hard to add muscle. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of protein, as we know, and it takes lots of other things that we know. The reason for that is because being a 300-pound, 2% bodybuilder in the days when we were hunter-gatherers, you became food. You weren't looking for food. You were somebody's meal because you couldn't survive without 4,000 or 5,000 calories a day, which was an impossibility to achieve, considering that we were chewing tubers. You have to remember, we came from an environment where we spent all of our waking hours looking for and chewing food. So, now we're trying to play with evolution, and we're trying to say, how do we unwind this? It's not easy. But I would also add to that if you add real muscle, we like to call it mature muscle. I'm 62 now. Okay. So we like to call it mature muscle, but if you add real muscle, it also doesn't disappear very fast. When you add muscle by all of these tricks and tweaks and drugs and stuff, it goes away pretty quickly once you stop. But if you've taken a decade or two to add 30, 40 pounds of muscle, and you take a year off because of something, you look in the mirror, you go, gee, I know I'm losing muscle. I'm losing shape, but I still have all that muscle. So hard gained, hard lost.
Maybe I can respond to that with 2 points. I'll try not to take too long. The interesting thing you mentioned about was strength versus muscle mass, cross-sectional area, if you wish, of muscle fibers. One of the great challenges of myostatin inhibition is that a lot of these drugs increase muscle mass without strength gain. And this is one of the reasons they fail through clinical testing. And this is one of the reasons many of the SARMs have struggled, because they see increases in lean body mass through SARMs, but that's not shown in functional outcomes, for want of a better word. And from a approvals point of view, they don't give a rat's ass how jacked you are. They're interested in the functional outcomes. So when you look at these high-profile examples of animals that have these gene deficiencies and that result in these natural myostatin positions, that they're not proportionally as strong as they look. It's not a model where we put on 20 pounds of tissue as a natural trainer. Perhaps you get a proportional increase in strength, and that's also true when you use anabolic compounds. But myostatin is the one exception where they see it seems that there is not a relationship between increase. And this is one of the big underlying problems between getting these drugs approved, because if you cannot demonstrate an improvement in functional outcome, you'll never get approval. No one's going to approve a drug that gets you jacked. But even as an athlete, you're kind of thinking, well, why are you doing this? So you look the part, but you can't perform. Do you know? It's
well, in fact, if we look at myostatin null, for instance, racing dogs, we also know that soft tissue damage is much more prevalent, and it's not because of the increase in strength in the muscle; it's because of the degradation of the development of soft tissue. So not only are they not stronger, but they're more prone to injury on top of it.
Correct, susceptible to injuries. Correct, and this is the great thread that you start pulling on, and you start unwinding, and you go. It is a great unmet need. I don't think anyone is going to say that, and we are going to continue to see research companies, looking into this and looking for the compound. But I honestly don't feel that compound is on the table today. I feel the same way about the non-steroidal SARMs that are being developed. I truly believe, hand on my heart, that the future of performance-enhancing drugs is more likely to be a compound that is not derived from testosterone, but we don't have it today. It's something we'll see in the future. So, in other words, it will retain. Go on, sorry.
I was going to say, I want to take a break. And because actually Luciano Ferrocchio, he actually asked a question that's coming up next. Can we extrapolate any of the existing data of what we know about follistatin, of what we know about DHT, of what we know about pregnenolone, and what we know about, or what we can extrapolate from this particular compound, if it would make you more prone to problems with your heart, cardiomyopathy, and other pathology? So we're gonna actually, I put this up now so that Luciano stays tuned. And we're going to jump into that on the other side. VictorBlackMasterclass.com is the place to go. If you want to work with Victor, he's available, and he works with athletes in all continents. So give him a try. And obviously for us older guys, maybe he's the guy that we should be working with. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more. Whether your goal is to build muscle or burn fat, you'll find everything you need at Redcon One. Need help getting a good night's sleep? Try Fade Out, or the most popular pre-workout supplement on the market today, Total War. Sign up for their new Transformation Challenge and win $10,000, or shop for apparel that people at the gym will know that you are serious about your training. Need a testosterone booster that works? Check out Boomstick. Whatever you need, you'll find the best quality supplements on the market at Redcon One. Go to redcon1.com. That's REDCON, the number 1.com, or go to superhumanradio.net and click the Redcon One banner ad today. Imagine if you had a digital twin, one that you could compare your own health and fitness outcomes to, one that showed you whether or not the things you're doing, food you're eating, or drinks you're drinking are actually working for you or against you. Well, now you can. The first ever advanced epigenetic saliva test that compares 20 million different data points of your DNA to help predict what is aging you faster or keeping you younger is being introduced to my audience at a 70% discount from the normal price. Go to seeds.md/epigenetic-test today to learn how to get your own digital twin that will help you take the steps to live longer and stay stronger. Don't wait, because this is a limited time offer not available anywhere else. Once these tests are gone, they're gone. Again, go to seeds.md/epigenetic-test today to learn more. You've heard me talk about the chill pill on the show and how effective it is at helping people who suffer from social anxiety, or sometimes when you just want to take the edge off to a long, stressful day. Well, listen to this story from Dylan Goutreau.
Definitely takes anxiety away, which I have a long history of having. Started out at 2 milligrams a day of Xanax. That was at 8 years old. And so I stopped using benzos 3 years ago. Extremely difficult. Yeah, so I spent about 3 years trying to find anything and everything I could that would be healthy for me to help with anxiety. Because I'm talking, full out panic attack. The chill pill was the first thing that I found that actually in the middle of a panic attack I can take, and it definitely subsides.
Go to drseeds.com. That's DRSEEDS.com. Use coupon code SHR and save 20% off your first bottle of the chill pill. Check it out. I promise this is one supplement that delivers. Are you still on the fence about Body Protection Complex BPC Oral from drseeds.com? Listen to Maggie Kuhn, one of the owners of the C-Bus Lifting Company gym in Columbus, Ohio.
I had been having some nagging tendon issues that weren't injuries, just things that were annoying. I'm 58 years old, so just older tendon kind of issues. For us powerlifters, we really don't stop training when we have just nagging issues. We just kind of keep pushing through. And I started the BPC. What I noticed was I was doing some heavy tricep stuff that would have killed me before when I had an elbow problem, and I was able to do this with literally no pain at all.
Go to drseeds.com, drseeds.com. Use coupon code SHR and save 20% off your bottle of BPC Body Protection Complex today. Do you remember those delicious toaster pastries you had when you were a kid? The rectangular sugar-filled snacks? Well, guess what? Legendary Foods has just made low-carb toaster pastry. This is the first of its kind, and honestly, these things are amazing. They have 3 to 4 net carb, less than 1 gram of sugar, and 9 grams of protein. You can eat them right out of the wrapper or lightly toast them. The only question is, which flavor? Strawberry or brown sugar cinnamon? They're available at eatlegendary.com and Amazon.
This is the Superhuman Channel, where we use oxygen for the power of good.
Welcome back. We're talking with Victor Black, who also has his own YouTube podcast that just launched, right? It's on YouTube, Victor?
Yeah, I'm actually just in the process of starting up. So we have one episode in the can.
Okay, good.
It's going to be a free weekly podcast, but yes, we're just kicking off.
So Luciano Ferraccio raises a good question, which is one of the questions that I had loaded for us today, and that is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. what do you, knowing what we know about follistatin, what we know about androgens in general, and let's address this in two different ways: training and non-training, because we know that training alone changes the morphology of the heart dramatically, and then training with androgens even more so. What do you think?
Okay, so I guess the challenge is there's pretty good evidence today. Just a few years ago, there were some major concerns about this impact as a consequence of that clinical pathway. Basically myostatin inhibition. There was a number of papers that raised questions. I think it's probably fair to say that in the last couple of years, kind of like since 2017, 2018, there's been some papers looking into this in detail, and it would appear that it's not going to be, a consequence that stops the development of these drugs, if that makes sense. However, and here would be my caveat: we're talking about, in clinical dosages.
Yeah, which isn't what bodybuilders are going to use.
Which is not what we do, right? So it's the classic case. So, what effect do we see on cardiac tissue from 2 milligrams per kilogram testosterone? It's very manageable. But I don't think anyone is going to say that, that when you start escalating that dose upwards, by, 4-fold, 5-fold, 6-fold, 10-fold, that those same studies can be held up as any sort of evidence to say it's perfectly safe. No better example than something like clenbuterol. Clenbuterol, there is absolutely no evidence that, clenbuterol at the types of doses that are used for, pharmaceutical interventions like 80 micrograms a day have any effect on the cardiovascular system at all. They're very well tolerated. But it's also very well, documented evidence that when you continue to escalate the dose, that you do see consequence. This is why they use the drug at 2,100 micrograms a day as a medical treatment, because that's what they're trying to do: strengthen the heart deliberately in certain, in a particular cohort. So what is true at this dose is certainly not true at every, ascending dose range. And so this is the great challenge of looking at evidence to say, just because 3 milligrams of ostarine looks, very well tolerated in this cohort, doesn't mean that 50 milligrams is okay. And so this would be my argument: is if someone said to me, look, there's evidence out there to say that, that this looks like a valid and viable, treatment methodology, I agree, at a certain dose. But, when we can't logically and practically expect that this is going to be the one drug that our tribe uses that way. They don't do that with anything else they do. They are using 10-fold that dose, and I just don't think it's responsible to say because that looks okay, then this is going to be okay. I don't think that's responsible.
There's another factor that plays into the discussion when we talk about the heart that a lot of people aren't aware of or misunderstand. So androgens like testosterone and like DHT actually influence the stroke and the ejection fraction of the heart. And that's great. That's good. That's like, okay, the pump is strong. But when you develop a stenosis in an artery and you have an ischemic event, the heart really needs to slow down to minimize damage, and high levels of androgens make the heart go, F this, man, keep pumping. And we see a lot more damage in ischemia reperfusion events with people on high levels of androgens simply because the pump isn't powering down. The pump is going, no, F this. I got all these androgen receptors activated. I'm just going to keep on going. And there's a lot more tissue damage. Have you read some of those studies as well?
I would agree with that, and it's one of the reasons that I recommend that anybody that's using anabolic and androgenic steroids, administer an ARB. My favorite of which is telmisartan, regardless of whether you have high blood pressure or not. Right? It's the best tool that we have for the mitigation of that outcome at this point in time. So a lot of people are loath to use blood pressure medications. They have some concern of it, but it's probably the one compound that we have that has the potential to offset the cardiac toxicity that's associated with these compounds. And I recommend, like, literally, you should use one by default. There's fabulous evidence to basically support the rationale, the logic behind it, and just consequentially, if you were to find yourself in a position where you know, are being treated by a medical practitioner for that thing, I guess what he's going to give you during that's the starting point for that discussion. That's the first line of treatment typically in that situation. So,
I like ARBs better than I do whole scale ACE inhibition. Frankly,
I'm not a big fan of ACE inhibitors at all, quite bluntly, and not the least of which reason is I use Trenbolone, and I happen to cough when I say that. So. The same mechanism of action that causes Trenbolone cough is what causes ARBs. It's the perfect storm. You take two drugs that basically, you know, work on the same underlying mechanism of action to cause that cough, and you have a coughing fit, like a bad one, right? But just get not using ACE inhibitors and using ARBs. That's why most people are directed to ARBs that have that cough, you know, because ARBs don't elicit that same consequence, at least to the same degree. Some individuals, you know, sensitive individuals, yes, but yeah. I am not a fan of ACE inhibitors in our tribe. I think you should just go straight to ARBs. And given the fact that we have a metabolic modulator, so it's not only an ARB, but it's a PPAR, you know, as well in the form of telmisartan. I think is like the classic thing. People are messing around with drugs like, you know, GW1516 and SR9009, and yet we have a human-approved version. Like, it goes back to that concept. What are you trying to achieve?
Right.
You know, how far through clinical testing is. So you have a drug that failed toxicity testing, standardized toxicity testing. It was abandoned by the developers because of concerns over, you know, cancer development. And yet over here sitting on the shelf, you have a drug that does almost the same thing, that's been in human clinical use for 30 years, that's, you know, easy to access, and it's an ARB. To me, it's a really simple decision. Which one will I use? The approved for human use drug that does those two things, or the drug that was abandoned by developers because it couldn't get past standardized toxicity testing?
Do you think it's even possible to get real YK-11? I mean, you know, people are really looking for this compound, and there's, you know, a sucker born every minute, as they say, and there's lots of people out there who'll sell you some other SARM. Maybe it's just some other SARM. Maybe it's of negligible consequence on your health, or maybe it's something that's contaminated. You think that there's even real YK-11 out there today?
I would argue, yes, there is. The challenge is, though, when I first started involving myself with performance-enhancing drugs, the hard part was finding someone that would talk to you about it and sell it to you. Right? But once you found that guy, what he pulled out that bag, you could be fairly confident it was what he said it was. Do you mean? Yes, there was, you know, counterfeit product going around in the 90s, but it wasn't as prolific as it is today. Do you mean? And I would argue that at least 50% of the drugs on the market today are not what they claim to be, regardless of what they are, whether they're SARMs or whether they're steroids or whether they're growth hormone or whatever. You know, we have a serious quality control problem in our community. Yeah, and you know, just the fact that you can kind of go. So here's a research chemical. You know, it's the lowest hanging fruit there is, because quite bluntly, let me deviate and come back. One of the biggest problems with research chemicals and SARMs, and that is 99.9% of the information that you read about these products comes from people who sell these products, and that is hardly the gold standard of, you know, like unbiased information. Do you know? So you go looking for information on SARMs. It's literally, let me tell you all the glorious things about this compound, and here's my affiliate link where you can buy the product. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, you shouldn't support people that have affiliate models. It's a valid business model, but I'm sure you can understand is there are people out there that don't really know what they're talking about at all. They're just trying to make money online. So they copy and paste someone else's website, who happened to copy and paste it from someone else, who happened to copy and paste it from someone else. And really all they're doing is like trying to put affiliate links into the marketplace to pick up things. They're not studying these compounds. They're not, you know, they don't have a quality control process in place. In other words, whatever they get shipped from the supplier, they tend to, you know, decant it into smaller, you know, volumes, as it were, and sell it off. This is the dominant business model of today. I do agree there are some individuals in the marketplace that take great pride in what they do, you know, but that is not the norm. That is the exception. So there are people out there that will, you know, get product in from a supplier, and they will undergo their own quality control testing procedure and before they put their name against that brand. But I'm sure you will agree with me that that's not 99% of the people. That's a small segment of the community. So my caution to people is, not only do you have to worry about, like, you know, if it's real YK-11, it's probably not. Do you know what I mean? If you look at this, you know, there's a number of studies that have been done on products that have been seized by customs in Switzerland, in Germany, you know, basically border seizures of drugs. Do you know what I mean? And they send the drugs off for testing. You know, what does it say on the label versus what's really in there? Do you know what I mean? Less than 50% of the product is legitimate today. Less than 50%.
I think that the more exotic, like just take injectable oils. I've always believed this. The more exotic, the more likely it's not real. And all it is testosterone enanthate or cypionate. So it's not like they're selling you, you know, nothing. But, and I've seen this even with female competitors who thought they were buying, you know, drugs of a very, very low androgenicity, and boom, it wasn't. So I tend to think you're safe with test cyp, test enanthate. Decadurabolin probably is safe, and Tren is yellow. You know, it's like if you get a clear bottle of Tren, it's not Tren. Just throw it away now. Don't even bother injecting it. Tren is always.
I would say probably more accurately is the more expensive a drug is, the more likely it is to be fake.
Well, and that's what I really meant. Yeah,
people don't fake testosterone. There's no money to be made, but they'll take a bottle of this and they'll put testosterone and sell it for twice the price of testosterone.
Yes.
That's how they make their money.
Yes.
So, you know, you very, very rarely buy fake, you know, testosterone and enanthate. It just doesn't happen, you know. But like as soon as you start moving into the more expensive compounds, the compounds that take more steps in the process to synthesize, and a lot of people don't understand that's why they cost more, because, you know, you start off with basically, you know, the testosterone molecule. One derivation away from that is DHT. Another derivation away from that is the next drug, and they're different. So the more reactor time that you need, basically, to convert a drug, you know, down the line, the more a drug costs. So primobolan is a very expensive drug, and it's very faked. You know, Anavar is a very expensive drug, and you find a lot of fake Anavar on the market. So what I would argue is typically is, you know, what is the price of the drug? Because more expensive drugs tend to be faked more often. And as a general rule of thumb, even when we're buying anabolic steroids, I speak very openly about these things because I live in Thailand. I can say a lot of things that other people can't get away with, and that is, there's literally tiers. There's, you know, first world pharmaceutical manufacturers like Bayer and you know Merck and these types of places. There's second tier manufacturers, which are really third world licensed pharmaceutical houses that are making for India and for Asia and for Africa and places like that. Then there are first tier UGL labs, the big labs that have hundreds of staff and you know millions of dollars invested in facilities in, you know, ex-Soviet bloc countries, etc., like that. And then you keep going down, and eventually you end up at this lab that you go, I have no idea who that person is. Like, it's literally a guy, you know, working from his kitchen table that he, you know, I can't say that it's true today, but just a few months ago, he would go on Alibaba and buy a kilogram of a product and decant it on his kitchen table. Do you know?
Right.
The quality control in this industry at this level, at the YK-11 level, is appalling. It's really bad. And when you look at the first world manufacturers, they don't sell it. The second world, you know, the third world pharmaceutical manufacturers, they don't sell it. Most of the tier one labs don't get involved in these compounds. Right. You know, so you end up like down at what I call the fourth and fifth and sixth tier suppliers before you can even buy the stuff. Do you know? So, you know, just that in itself, you know, says a great deal. Yes, I would argue you can buy these things. Obviously, people doing research are able to get their hands on these products. So that sort of suggests if you're a researcher and you can get it, then theoretically, if you're a user, you can get it, theoretically.
Yeah, and a lot of these research labs are running their own mass spec on stuff before they put it into action in a study that they just got funded $100,000 for. They're not just going to take somebody's. Sure. Yeah, they're. I want to take our last commercial break, and then I want to discuss whether or not you think it's even safe if you could even get real YK-11. We have a lot of people in the audience who say no, and it's a worthy cap on that. And then I want to talk about you, shine a light on you and what you're up to. So let's do this. Let's just run a commercial break here, and we'll be right back.
Fantasies.com.
Oh, that's not what I wanted. I love beef. And if you love beef, listen up. I've discovered the best tasting beef in the world, and that's not an exaggeration, at Piedmontese.com. The Piedmontese breed is famous from Italy for being lean and unbelievably tender with half the fat and calories of traditional beef. Even typically tough cuts are tender when it comes from the Piedmontese cows. And for the first time ever, Piedmontese cows are being raised here in the USA. Get 2 free 10-ounce New York strips when you purchase $50 or more at Piedmontese.com with code SHR. Go to Piedmontese.com and use code SHR today. You will never eat any other type of beef ever again. You've heard about blood flow restricted training since 2006 on SHR, but you're still on the fence. Well, here's the push. BFR is more effective at building muscle than anabolic steroids. That's right, I went there, but it's because it's the truth. My experience with the Be Strong blood flow restriction system is proof to me, and now I'm asking myself why I waited so long. You'll see undeniable changes in the targeted muscles in days and weeks like nothing you've ever tried before. I will never stop using them. Give Be Strong a try. Go to BSTRONG.training/super-human and use code SHR for 10% off.
Planet Earth CBD offers a fast-acting transdermal patch that targets your aches and pains for the relief you need. Not only is the patch uniquely patented, but it is widely believed to provide larger quantities of available cannabinoids to the source of pain than other brands' subpar products. Effective for 24 to 48 hours. Experience the benefits of Planet Earth's high-quality transdermal patch. Manufactured by Next Generation Technology in an FDA-registered facility. This pressure-sensitive adhesive delivers rich hemp extract directly through the skin. Be it a neck ache or a headache, you can count on CBD to take off the edge. Go to planetearthcbd.com today to learn more.
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game. To distance itself even further from the rest of the pack, Synthogen X2 now has double the key active ingredients. If you've ever wondered what steroid-like recovery feels like, Synthogen X2 delivers. See why others compare it favorably to powerful bodybuilding drugs at synthogen.com. Mass Pro Synthogen. When you train with it, you'll gain with it.
Quest Nutrition makes bars, cookies, chips, and pizzas out of complete dairy-based proteins. Our products minimize net carbs and sugar without sacrificing taste. Each delicious chocolate-flavored chip, cookie chunk, and crunchy crumble is custom made to maintain Quest macros. It's time to enjoy foods that work for you, not against you. It's time to enjoy your Quest.
If there is one mineral you should be worried about not getting enough of, it's magnesium. Magnesium is the body's master mineral, powering over 300 critical reactions, including detoxification, fat metabolism, energy, and even digestion is influenced by the presence of magnesium. That's why I'm so excited to tell you about a new magnesium product I've been taking now called Magnesium Breakthrough. It's the ultimate magnesium supplement, easily the best I've ever seen or experienced. With all 7 forms of magnesium, I was able to arrange an amazing deal for my audience, and I guarantee it's the best deal available on this product. Seriously, with volume discounts combined with our custom 10% coupon code SHR10, you can save up to 40% off select packages of Magnesium Breakthrough. And I promise that this deal is only available on this specific website, magbreakthrough.com/SHR. You won't find that deal on Amazon or even on the company's own website. Go to magbreakthrough.com/SHR and use code SHR10 to save up to 40% off select packages of Magnesium Breakthrough.
This is the Superhuman Channel, doing reps with the weight of the world.
Welcome back. So the question is on the table. Is YK-11 even safe? Let's assume you can actually get the goods, the real stuff. What do you think, Victor?
Okay, so I will give my opinion about the compound, and I would say I think there is a place for it, yes. But first, I would like to explain what that is, and then most people would go, yeah, but that's so left of field that it applies to perhaps a couple of percent of people. I would argue that we have, as I said, a range of very well understood, very well supported in evidence compounds that we can access, quality products approved for human use. And there are at least 5 metabolic pathways that we can modulate with a high degree of confidence and a high degree of, let's just call it safer use. Though I don't like the term safe, right? Safer use,
right?
Yep. So by the time you get your anabolic steroids, by the time you get your, human growth hormone, by the time you get your, metformin, by the time you get your metabolic modulator like telmisartan, by the time you get your insulin, if you want to use insulin, by the time you get a catalyst on the table, by the time you get a buffer on the table, you're talking about 8 different drugs now. That's a lot of drugs. Now, is there one pathway that we haven't addressed? Yes, I agree. That's the one right now. So in other words, if you're doing all of those and you're not realizing, the outcomes you want, I have to ask the question, why not?
Yeah, is myostatin inhibition even to matter to you?
That's not the problem. You need to go back to basics because you're missing something. But I do agree, it's fascinating. It's disingenuous to say it's not of interest to people. So what I would say, if you're that individual that has all of those things in place and understands how all these compounds work and you're using them optimally and you're getting great outcomes and you're getting quality product, and after that, you want to reach into what I call the research bag and pull out something interesting like a myostatin inhibitor, regardless of which one it is, including YK-11, by all means do that. But unfortunately, that is not the methodology that most people employ. They read something on some website that this is the holy grail of bodybuilding supplements, and they're into it on their second performance enhancing drug cycle, thinking it's the answer, it's the holy grail, it's a thing that's going to give them 100 pounds of muscle, and that is just simply not demonstrated in any evidence or any anecdotal observation. So, yes, if you're that guy that I just described, you've got your androgens, you've got your insulin, you've got your growth hormone, you've got your metabolic modulator, you've got your catalyst, you've got your buffer, you've got all these things that lined up, and they're all working fabulous. You should be growing like a fucking weed, basically, right, is the answer. Right. And if you're not, there's a problem. And if you're not, the answer is not myostatin. That's not the answer, right? But I do concede, I am fascinated by these things. So, am I going to put my hand in that bucket and look at things from time to time? Of course. And I don't think you should be berated for doing so. But I think a lot of people just completely miss the boat of what we're talking about here. And that is, I think if you're going to use these compounds, you should be looking at saying, look, I'm going to use these compounds for the next 10, 15, 20 years. What's the point of using them for a year? There's no point. Just stay natural, right? But if you cross the threshold like I have and you're going to live here for 20 years, you need to spend the overwhelming majority of your time using drugs that we know are safer to use. There is no question mark hangover.
And the reality is, you know who's going to use this compound?
Unfortunately, young children, kids,
young guys who are hardly training at all. They're not eating near enough calories a day, and they just think that this is going to turn them into Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
And the reason for that is twofold. One is because of the oral administration pathway. That's extremely attractive to people starting out. The needle phobia. And I understand that. The first time I injected myself, my hand was fucking shaking like a leaf. I do understand that. I started on oral steroids. My first cycle was Anavar. And I am honest enough to admit, the reason I chose Anavar because I was nervous about injecting myself. So I'm not opposed to that discussion. But there comes a point in time where you have to basically, like if you're going to get into this game, you just have to embrace that part of our culture. It's just reality. So it's people that are using the oral pathway. That's the first group. And it's the people that will do a cursory search on Google, and they will be misled by people who market these products saying you get steroid-led effects, and they're perfectly safe, bro. The people like myself that are prepared to dive 3 days down into the literature are not fooled by that information. But unfortunately, there is a group of individuals, young people just starting out, that's the extent of the research they do. A cursory Google search where you find, I'm not going to mention names, people espousing the virtue of these compounds because they are literally promoting something that has an oral administration pathway, the perception of legality, right? And it's just, unfortunately, a huge disservice to our community. So I'm trying to paint the picture here where I'm not opposed to research chemicals, but unfortunately, the people who might benefit the most from them are the least likely to use them, and the people who are the most likely to use them
shouldn't be using them.
They shouldn't be using them at all. So it's this catch-22. If you said to me, "Look, I'm going to get someone to try some," I'm going to say, whatever, fine, dude. Like, I'm not your mother. I'm not going to get in your way. But you're not the typical user. The typical user has been misled by this fact that, SARMs are safe. And this is a SARM. No, it's an anabolic steroid to begin with. It's from the class of steroids that potentially carry the most problem, the progestin, basically, steroids, that the class that Trenbolone comes from. And then it has all the potential unknowns that are associated. And when I say unknowns, I don't even just mean is it safe. I mean, does it even fucking work? I'm going to suggest that the reason that you do hear positive anecdotal feedback about this compound is this, and that is that it is an anabolic steroid, right? Most people that use it is their first exposure to a steroid because they've used Ostarine, and then they used LGD-4003, and then they used YK-11, and they went, holy crap, that's fucking great, because that's the first steroid they touched. So the surge in progress was moving from a SARMs to a steroidal SARMs. That's what the anecdotal feedback is relevant to. It's your first exposure to a steroid after you've been messing around with non-steroidal SARMs, as opposed to the fact that it's a myostatin inhibitor. That's clinical.
Well, and then let's also point out, history, looking back is always better than guessing what's ahead of us. And so I remember when there was an oral released around maybe 2000 and I want to say 7 or 8. And it was, what is the oral Trenbolone that people used to take back in the old days that destroyed your liver, but it was unbelievably anabolic? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it is literally an oral version of Trenbolone. Absolutely, yes.
But it was called methyldianolone,
I can't remember.
It was methyldianolone. It was methyldianolone. Now, methyldianolone was taken off the market for medical use because it caused such bad liver damage. But it was so anabolic. It was like crazy anabolic. It was what we talk about methyl 1 tests being so anabolic. Methyldianolone was way more anabolic than that. But it was removed because even the most willing to accept the risks bodybuilders were like, no, that's where I draw the line. I'm not going to kill myself just for muscle. And then around 2007, 2008, a company introduced methyltrianolone, which was one hepatic conversion away from methyldianolone. And they said, look, they're going to sell it in 0.5 milligram tabs because 1 milligram of methyldianolone destroyed your liver. And of course, this was a period of time where I was a lot more experimental and I was younger. And I thought, well, I took up to 10 milligrams a day. It did nothing. It did nothing. And when I had my liver assay done after the cycle, my liver was fine. So either it was bunk or it just doesn't work. And I kind of feel like YK-11 doesn't interest me at all when I have so many things that I know work, when I put them to use and I eat right and I sleep right, and I train hard. I know the results I'm going to get. I just don't see the value in experimenting with this. I really don't.
So if you would allow me, maybe I can offer a framework to your listeners, about how I think they should go about evaluating compounds that they might consider for their use. Yeah. So the first thing I think everybody should do is you need to create like these two imaginary piles of drugs. And we call one pile of drugs our basal use PEDs. Our daily, this is going to become firm friends. And then we have another pile of drugs I call situational use. Therefore, contest preparation, breaking through a plateau, hell, even just experimenting. By all means, put some drugs in that pile. I do. I have no problem with that. But you should spend most of your time with the drugs that hundreds of thousands of men have used successfully for many, many, many decades to build fabulous physiques with some hard work and some good nutritional practice and some sleep hygiene and some stress management. You put these 4 things on the table and the magic happens. Yeah. And on occasion, by all means, put your hand into that second pile of drugs, situational use. By all means, no problem. But when you look back at 10 years of use, you should have a few months in total exposure to those compounds. Now, maybe you'll stumble across something and you go, holy fuck, that's great. I certainly have drugs in there. You know, one of my favorite drugs is Superdrol. I love Superdrol, but it is brutal on the body.
Right.
So in other words, it belongs in that secondary category. It doesn't mean you would never use it, but you can't live on it. And so this is the point. I just logically and rationally, here's a pile of drugs that have been used for 50 years fundamentally, hundreds of thousands of testimonials about the fact they work, including myself, right? And if you use them in collaboration and conjunction with good nutrition and good training practices and good sleep hygiene and good stress management, I promise you the outcome that you're looking for. It's there on the offer. And then, as I said, just occasionally, if something sparks your interest, by all means, put your hand in the bucket. But I can tell you, after 32 years of experience, right, it's very, very rare that you put your hand into that bucket, the situational use bucket, and pull out something that you go, wow, that's fabulous, and it has no consequence of use. Most drugs that you pull out and go, man, that's a great tool that you might use on occasions to break through a plateau, or that's a drug that you might use under situational use. It comes with a price to pay. Methylated compounds are an example. I suggest most people don't use methylated compounds by default. I certainly don't. I don't use them like that. It doesn't mean I don't use them on occasion, certainly for contest preparation. But we're talking about a methylated compound here.
Yeah, no, I'm exactly where you are with methylated compounds. In fact, I even avoid methylated corticosteroids. I avoid corticosteroids at all costs. But I tell people when they take these methylprednisone and stuff like that, I say, stuff is horrible for your liver. Like, you shouldn't take that. But anyway, look.
Just to be clear to your listeners, though, YK-11 is a methylated compound.
Yeah, I know. It says methyl on it.
You're saying like this is the point. So by definition, it belongs in that basket because it's methylated.
Very, very hepatotoxic. It's not good for you. Listen, Victor, I want to have you back on the show, first of all. I've got a lot of topics that I thought about while we were doing this interview, number one. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your pedigree, and obviously they can go to victorblackmasterclass.com to reach out to you and work with you. You not only work with bodybuilders per se, but more mature bodybuilders who are looking at HRT and or longevity as part of the equation of their competition.
I would say that's really my market. I have a couple of what I would call world-class athletes. So for example, there's a gentleman called Paul Rowe. I don't know whether you know Paul. He's like an over 50 class competitor at the world stage level. Out of England, but again, Paul's very moderate in the use of his compounds. He's not a get big or die trying kind of guy, right? And most of my clients, even those that are competitive bodybuilders at a high level, they place longevity and they place health first. So I'm very transparent. I put my hand up and say, look, if you're the guy that wants to drag his ass onto the Olympia stage at any cost, and it's fair to say that those individuals do exist. There was a study not that long ago, called the Goldman Dilemma, where they asked elite level athletes, would you take this compound if you knew 5 years from now it would cause you to have a heart attack and die? And a surprisingly large percentage of elite athletes said yes, they would take that choice. So it's disingenuous to say, look, there people aren't out there. It's demonstrated that there are people out there willing to take high risk for reward. Yeah, that's not my audience. That's not my niche. And I would suggest if that's what people want, I'm not your guy. My audience are really typically older men who want to be the best version of themselves, but they don't feel that a doctor prescribed HRT or TRT solution is reaching enough for them, and I tend to agree. So that's really where I work with people that I like to call supernatural men. There's nowhere in hell you could talk about what you're doing as being TRT. That's disingenuous. It's not. It's the use of enhancement products. It's the use of PEDs. But at such moderate levels that you're on occasions just outside of physiological range, but on a number of metabolic pathways. So it's not just testosterone. It's estrogen. It's other things. And very often my clients end up with a relatively long list of compounds that they use, but very small dosages, very, very small dosages. So often at dosages that we would consider to be clinical use, not far outside of anti-aging clinicals. But the amazing thing is when you put multiple products, polypharmacy, as I call it, together, there is a tremendous synergistic effect.
Right.
So it's
right.
like 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2.
Right.
So,
right.
so what I find is, by willing to use multiple compounds, you get a synergistic effect. But I will say this for guys listening: if you want to take that pathway, it's absolutely more moving parts. It is. It's more to learn. It's more to understand. It's more expensive to do it that way than to buy, a shitload of testosterone and just, smash on the androgen receptor with a 20-pound sledgehammer. And the great unknown for my audience, I try to be very, very transparent about this, is we have fabulous data to support the use of these drugs at the types of dosages that I typically use myself, but we don't have evidence on polypharmacy use. In other words, what's the consequence of using all those things together? We just don't know. So This is why I don't like the term safe. I think it's a lower risk model or a safer use model than blasting or cruising.
Right.
That's my preferred pathway. But as I said, most of my clients are just older men who have been training usually for many years. This is not their first rodeo, who are frustrated by the lack of quality of information they find online from most sources. It's just copy paste, and they stumble across something I've said or a video I've made or content that I've written at some point, and they tend to gravitate towards me because I'm in their age group, and we end up being compatible to each other, and end up as both coach and client and long-term relationships. That's really where I stand. People don't come to me for 12 weeks; they come to me, for years and years and years at a time, basically. So
the website is victorblackmasterclass.com.
Correct.
His writing are very well thought out. He does a lot of research before he writes. It's worthy of your investigation. We're going to have him back on the show. I already have other topics I want to talk to him about. So if you have any questions for him, email them to onair@superhumanradio.net. And who knows, maybe your question will be the topic of our next discussion. Victor, thanks for being here. I know it's where you are, it's like midnight, right?
It's just gone 1:15 a.m. So we're on the other side of the world. Amazingly good connection, though, hasn't it? Been fabulous connection. So
yeah, I know we got lucky. Well, we'll have you back on, and thanks for being here today, Vic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity, Carl. I really do. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And let's see. Now, tomorrow is Thursday. I'm trying to think. We have a really good show. I think we're doing something about BFR, blood flow restriction, tomorrow. I forget. Elisa handles all the scheduling, but we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for being here today, and please share the show. Thank you.